Okay, we're on YouTube now. And let's start off with an introduction to S77, Senator Sears' sports betting bill. And Tucker, I think you're the drafter of this bill. So why don't you give us a little overview of the bill and then walk us through it, okay?
Absolutely. Good morning, everyone. Tucker Anderson with the Office of Legislative Counsel. S77 proposes to establish a system for the operation of mobile and lottery-based sports wagering through the Department of Liquor and Lottery. It would add a new Chapter 25 to Title 31 to establish this system. And to give you an idea of what that might look like, it is proposed to be similar to how the state runs its control model for spirits in the alcohol industry, where the department would contract with agents for the conduct of this mobile sports wagering system. For a walkthrough of the bill, it is essentially one massive section establishing the new chapter. I will walk you through. One thing that I'll note is that for the first section we'll cover, containing the definitions for purposes of the chapter, it may be helpful moving forward if I prepare for you a table of the intersecting definitions. Many of the definitions are cross-referential or contain further defined terms. And because it's in alphabetical order, it can get a bit confusing as we walk through. So I'll note that for now and start the walkthrough if that is what the committee would like.
Tucker, are you in a position to, before you walk through, give us sort of the lay of the land in the country and a little bit of the history of this issue? Or should we leave that to the providers?
I can give you a bit of background. The landscape is changing somewhat rapidly from the last time the committee took up this issue. Prior to a Supreme Court decision around PASPA, which I wish I could remember what each of those initials stands for, but it related to wagering around professional sporting events. There were only 3 or 4 states that allowed sports betting. And that is because they allowed sports betting prior to the passage of a federal law, PASPA, around that sports wagering. The ones that I can recall offhand were Nevada, Montana, and I believe New Jersey. After a Supreme Court decision that effectively opened up for the states, state-based sports wagering, we have potentially let's say 12 to 15 states that have started exploring this area through different models of sports wagering, which could roughly be broken up into monopoly-based, and by monopoly, I mean state-controlled lottery-based sports wagering systems, and then competitive markets where, for the most part, states license the opportunity to host sports wagering either in lounges, which would be similar to lottery rooms or casino rooms where you can place your sports wagering bets, or through mobile sports wagering, again, professionally licensed through the state. The states that led in the latter system were Pennsylvania and New Jersey. More recently, we have a system that has opened up in a neighboring state, New Hampshire. There are a ton of great resources that explain the state of the states, and they can provide you with a breakdown state by state of what is permitted. And I can provide you with those materials when we wrap up this morning.
Great.
That would be helpful.
Okay.
Yeah, actually, we've gotten NCSL and CSG have both sort of devoted bits about it quite regularly as all these states explore this.
Okay. So you're saying there are about 12 to 15 states that have short-term legalized sports betting?
Yes, and again, the models vary as to what is permitted. And I say 12 to 15 because there are a few states that have allowed the potential for sports wagering systems, but only for tribal institutions in those states. And then you have, let's say, 10 to 12 where there is an opened market, from what I recall.
Okay.
But I can send you all the state-by-state breakdown.
Okay, good. Are you going to
Would-
pull up the bill on the screen? Okay,
That was going to be my next question, whether you wanted me to screen share.
sure.
Okay.
And to the extent anybody has any questions as we go along, shout them out, though I do see everybody right now as well. Not everybody. So if you have a question, jump in, but let's go with the screen.
All right, and I'm gonna turn off my camera to save some of my mountaintop bandwidth, so please forgive me for that. So beginning with section 1301, we have the definitions for purposes of this new chapter 25. The first and potentially most important definition here is a definition of agent, and that is a party who is authorized by contract or agreement with the Department of Liquor and Lottery to conduct a sports book. Sports book will be defined later on. Category of wager means the kind of event being wagered on. This is a definition that could use some sprucing up in a bit more detail, and that may have to come from the department and the stakeholders. Collegiate sports event means a sports or athletic event participated in or offered by an institution that offers educational services beyond the secondary level. This definition is going to be important for some of the prohibited sports events later on. On page 2, we have definitions for commissioner and department, both of which the committee is familiar with. High school sports event means a sports or athletic event participated in or offered by an institution that offers educational services at the secondary level, high schools. In-play sports wager, a term of art for the industry, means a sports wager on a sports event after the sports event has begun and before it ends. Lottery sports wagering means a tier 3 wager placed through a lottery-based network. And tier 3 wager will be further defined later on. A mobile sports wagering platform means the combination of hardware, software, and data networks used to manage, administer, record, or control sports wagers. Professional sports event, an event at which 2 or more persons participate in a sports or athletic event and receive compensation in excess of actual expenses for their participation in the event. So you have 2 threshold requirements here. First, that there are 2 more persons participating. Second, that they receive compensation. So this would not cover, for example, the world record breaking marathon time where there was only 1 runner who was participating in that marathon. Prohibited sports bettors. We have first, any member or employee of the department or their spouse, child, sibling, consanguinity in the same household as a member or employee of the department. Any principal or employee of any agent, so those that are conducting the sports book. Any contractor of the department or its agents when the contract relates to sports wagering. Any contractor or employee of an entity that conducts sports wagering in another jurisdiction when the person who is placing the bet, as a result of their employment, possesses confidential or non-public information related to the wager that is being placed. So that would be the inside information bettor. Any amateur or professional athlete if the sports wager is based in whole or part on an athletic event overseen by the athlete's governing sports body. So an NHL player could not bet on NHL games. Any sports agent, owner, or employee of a team, player, umpire, referee, coach, what have you, or official of a sports governing body, if the wager is based in whole or in part on an athletic event overseen by the governing body. Then subdivision G covers proxies or agents that might be placing a bet on behalf of a prohibited sports bettor. Subdivision H covers minors. You have to be 18 years old. Prohibited sports events. These are events that no bettor may place a bet on. Collegiate sports events in which one of the participants is a collegiate team of an institution that is primarily located in Vermont, unless the collegiate sports event is subject to the provisions of this subdivision. And here it should say capital B as well, because we're going to get to those in a second. High school or collegiate sports event that takes place in Vermont, and amateur or professional sports event where the participants are primarily under 18 years of age. So the exceptions to prohibited sports events here, first, it does not mean the games of a collegiate sports tournament. So think of the March Madness tournament that just took place, in which a Vermont college team participates, nor does it include any games of a tournament that occurs outside Vermont, even though some of the individual games or events are held in Vermont, and provided further that the wagers are permitted on collegiate tournament games in which a Vermont team participates only if the outcome of the wager that is being placed is based on the outcome of all of the games within the tournament. Sportsbook is defined as the business of accepting wagers on any sports event by any system or method of wagering. Sports governing body, which was included in some of the previous definitions we covered about the prohibited events and prohibited bettors, means the organization that prescribes final rules and enforces codes of conduct with respect to a sporting event and the participants. A sports wager means cash or cash equivalent paid by an individual to participate in the sports wagering. Sports wagering itself means wagering on sporting events or any portion of a sporting event, or on the individual performance statistics of athletes participating in the sports event by any system or method of wagering, including in-person communication and electronic communication through the internet or mobile devices. Sports wagering shall include single game bets, teaser bets, parlays, over-under bets, prop bets. There is an enumerated and exhaustive list, but recall that under our statutes, include means included, but not limited to.
Right.
Subdivision 17 through 19 wrap up this section and describe the varying tiers of sports wager that are subject to the oversight of the department. Tier 1 sports wagers mean sports wagers that are placed before the start of the sporting event and that are determined solely by the final score or the final outcome of that single sports event. Tier 2 sports wagers cover exclusively in-play sports wagering. Tier 3 covers all of the other sports wagers that don't fall into Tier 1 or Tier 2. And if you'll recall, they are wrapped into the previous definition around lottery-based sports wagering that may be approved by the department.
Tucker, let me just ground us a little bit here. Is the result people who engage in online sports betting now with offshore companies, is there any illegality to that in violation of Vermont law for the player or for the company that's taking those bets presently?
So for the conduct of that sports book, so the offshore companies, yes, in theory. In practice, I don't know how the state would be able to go after any of those actors. For the bettor, it's a little bit less clear. Title 13 does have criminal penalties for the gamblers or bettors under certain circumstances, but we do not have a specific criminal penalty that would be tied to this sort of sports wagering or sports betting. And I believe that the department offered a little bit of clarity and opinion on that when they were doing their walkthrough of the iLottery proposals. So the answer is, under Vermont law, yes, in theory for both, but we don't have any precedent for enforcement
So
on either party.
as far as somebody who bets online presently, you're not aware of any prosecutions that have taken place in the state of Vermont?
I am not aware of that. No.
Okay, and is that any different for, I noticed somewhere in here there was like in-person betting, I guess the old fashioned, and maybe it still exists of, using a bookie, so to speak. Is that any different? Or would that be theoretically covered by the same laws, but no prosecutions there either?
So from what I recall in Title 13, there is an express prohibition on that type of gambling in Vermont with the in-person placement of wagers. The language seems to still be tied to the type of wagering, like numbers. If you know what number gambling is, it used to be back in the day that you would gamble on the last three numbers, for example, of the total bets placed, value of bets placed on a horse race. So you would pick three numbers, 1, 9, 3. And if those were the last three numbers of the total amount bet on the horse races from the previous day, you would win the pool of money. Those sort of pooled bets are prohibited in Vermont. I am not sure what the application would be to in-person wagering on sporting events.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Let's go on.
Section 1302 outlines the duties of the department for purposes of the chapter. Subsection A, the department and its agents are authorized to operate sports books that offer tier 1 through 3 sports wagers through a mobile sports wagering platform by mobile devices or over the internet. At any given time, the department may authorize up to 6 mobile sports wagering agents to conduct sports books within the state. So there's a cap on 6 agents. Subsection B, the department is also authorized to offer sports wagers through lottery retailers. The department shall determine the type of wagering permitted at lottery retailers, and they may retain vendors to support the operation of a sports book through those retailers.
So this is different than, this is an alternative or an addition to possibly an agent who does a mobile platform. This is where you'd go in and actually use like a lottery machine to place your bets.
Correct.
Okay.
Subsection C, the department or its agents, through its agents, shall provide age verification measures, identity verification through secure online databases, or in the case of the lottery retailers, examination of a photo ID, They shall ensure that mobile sports wagers be initiated and received within the state and not be intentionally routed outside of the state. And this doesn't cover incidental intermediate routing of a wager. This subdivision covers what you will come to know as geofencing, ensuring the location of the bettor.
Is this, sorry to interrupt, but I'm guessing that the structure of this bill is taken from another state law or combination of other state laws that are already in existence. And if that's true, can you tell us what state this most looks similar to?
So some of the pieces mirror other states. The overall model does not. So some of these pieces mirror what has been implemented, for example, in New Jersey and Pennsylvania, especially some of the details around the rules that the department will be adopting regarding house rules or minimum security measures or auditing measures. The overall system, I believe, is a proposal that was brought to you last year by the Department of Liquor and Lottery. And they may be able to provide more clarity and background on why this model was proposed.
Okay, we do have, I think Gary's on our agenda or certainly around to help fill in some of that.
All right, so they shall provide wager limits for daily, weekly, and monthly amounts consistent with the best practices in addressing problem gambling, a voluntary self-exclusion program for players to exclude themselves from wagering, security mechanisms to ensure the confidentiality of wagering and personal and financial information, except as otherwise authorized by this chapter. There are provisions later on that provide for information sharing. The department shall approve wager categories and types in a reasonable time frame. Once a particular category or wager type is approved, it may be used on multiple events afterwards without requiring further approval. The department may issue general approval for agents to conduct enumerated types and categories of wagers. The department shall only approve wagers on categories of events where the outcome can be verified and can be generated by a reliable and independent process, and where the event is conducted in conformity with applicable laws. Wagers made under this chapter shall be made with cash or cash equivalent, other payment types, and finally, any other means approved by the department. So there's the potential that you could use your Bitcoin for this later on. Any agent who sends or receives electronic sports wagers is responsible to ensure that any transfer of that wager is initiated and received and completed within the state of Vermont. So again, this is related to the geofencing. The agent also has a duty to ensure. Section 1303 authorizes the department to adopt rules, including emergency rules that are necessary to implement the chapter, provided that the commissioner demonstrates that immediate adoption is necessary to avoid a threat to public health, safety, or general welfare. And then we move on to rules that are mandatory, that the department is directed to adopt in order to implement this program. In the subdivisions that follow, there's going to be an exhaustive list of the minimum rules that will be adopted.
Okay, I don't think we need to go through all of them, but presently, there are no rules, right? Zero rules for sports betting.
In
Except,
Vermont, correct.
so we don't even have the rule that says we can't?
I believe that you have some permission for fantasy sports games and wagering. but not for this type of sports wagering.
And may I just ask a question? I know we don't want to go through the exhaustive list of rules, but I'm just curious why the department may do this rather than shall adopt rules.
So subsection A is discretionary and will allow the department to adopt rules in order to implement the purposes of the chapter overall. Subsection B requires them to adopt certain minimum rules before the program is allowed to open in the state. So you have the threshold rules that the department must adopt, and then you have some discretion in subsection A, both for rules governing the chapter and emergency rules when necessary. And perhaps the department could provide some background on that, because I believe that emergency rules also came into play with regard to the lottery over the last 4 years. And Senator Sorokin, thank you for the permission to not read through the exhaustive list. I was waiting for that. In general, the rules govern minimum security requirements for agents, computer, IT, and data security requirements. These relate, if you remember the last bill, back to operator systems behind the sports wagering platforms. Minimum house rules, these will ultimately, the house rules will be adopted by the agents, but the department is going to establish rules for what minimum requirements are for those house rules. Minimum accounting controls, and these will later be subject to audit by the department. Subsection C is going to require annual reports from the agents that shall be delivered to the sports wagering unit, which will be developed in the section that follows. Reports must contain all of the information required for compliance with the department's rules that we just did the 25,000 foot view of. It shall contain a responsible gaming plan. That shall include information related to the posting of materials related to problem gaming, resources to be made available to sports bettors expressing concerns about gaming, and house-imposed player limits. Each agent shall submit the responsible gaming plan required by the preceding subdivision for department review and approval prior to conducting any sports wagering within the state. Section 1304 establishes the sports wagering unit within the Division of Lottery. That unit shall be responsible for ensuring compliance with the requirements of the chapter and the rules adopted by the department and the authority granted by the chapter. In addition, the sports wagering unit is tasked with ensuring that the department's agents maintain cash reserves available to pay their wagers, shall not accept any wager on a sports event unless it has received approval from the department to conduct that type or category of wager, and ensure that the transfer of that wager is initiated, received, and completed within the state of Vermont, and that only incidental intermediate routing occurs. And again, that's now tripling down on geofencing. Section 1305 provides prohibited activities. The department and its agents are prohibited from accepting or making payment relating to sports wagers made by prohibited sports bettors, accepting sports wagers on prohibited sports events, or accepting wagers from persons who are physically outside of the state at the time the wager is placed. Section 1306 provides that the proceeds received by the department less administrative costs of the department shall be deposited in the general fund. Section 1307 requires that departments and agents may participate in national and international monitoring services and associations and may share betting information with those entities in order to ensure the integrity of sports wagers and sports events. So this is limited permission to share some of the information that they are receiving under these mobile sports wagering platforms with governing bodies in order to monitor activities both for the sporting events and for the sports wagers.
How do you deal with privacy concerns?
So this section actually does not require further confidentiality once the department and the commissioner have shared the information, and that's something that the committee may want to look into. I know the committee works on issues with the Department of Labor quite frequently, and they have a good model for sharing otherwise confidential information and then passing statutory confidentiality duties on to the recipients of that information. And I can send you some sections related to, for example, the UI program, where they can conduct investigations and share information from the UI system and require confidentiality of those that they share the information with.
Okay.
The commissioner may restrict, limit, or exclude wagering on a sports event if it is determined that the restriction, limitation, or exclusion is necessary to ensure the integrity of the sports. Section 1308 provides the department with access to financial and compliance reports from its agents and allows them to conduct audits of the reports to ensure that the state receives the contractual share of the revenue. Section 1309 provides that the department shall retain oversight of its agents to ensure that all of the activities are conducted in accordance with this chapter, any contractual terms, and any rules adopted by the department. The failure to comply with this statute, this chapter, contractual terms, or any rules adopted by the department may be brought before the Board of Liquor and Lottery, and the board is granted authority to impose sanctions on an agent for a violation, which may include monetary penalties, suspension of the agent's operations, and the termination of all agent operations within the state. The department is also granted authority to bring an action in a court of competent jurisdiction for damages related to any contract violation. Section 1310 deals with confidentiality of records. As Senator Clarkson knows, one of my few areas of expertise. When produced or acquired by the board pursuant to this chapter, the following records are exempt from the Public Records Act, and here is the key clause: and shall be kept confidential. This means that the board, and likely it should be added the board and department, since the department and the commissioner are handling most of these records anyway. That means that there is a duty of confidentiality applied to the department. They are not permitted to share any of this information except for the purposes that were previously outlined. Personal information and background check documents, lists of names, including the names on the voluntary self-exclusion program, trade secrets and financial records, and records relating to agent security, technology, facilities, or systems. For the most part, the subdivisions 1 through 4 mirror existing and enumerated exemptions in the Public Records Act 1 VSA section 317C, but they are specific to this program and are required to be held confidential. There will be no balancing.
May I ask a question on that section?
Please.
Just regarding the confidentiality, those records, are they available for audit purposes?
By the department, or are you asking by other state agencies?
Well, for example, the state auditor is examining the functions of the board or the department. Would the auditor have access to that information if it was necessary in order to complete an audit, for example, an audit of security procedures?
Senator Brock, I'm going to have to go back and look at the Auditor of Accounts statutes, but it is my recollection that the auditor is given general permission under its establishing statutes to access otherwise confidential records.
I believe that's the
but
case. I wonder if you could just confirm that for me.
I will definitely take a look, and I believe that the auditor is then required to further keep that information confidential if there's a public records request. But I can take a look at the statute and send that to
Great,
you.
thank you.
You got it. Subsection B provides that the exemptions that are created here shall not be subject to the 5-year review period under 1 VSA 317E. And to bring you all back to 2019, at that point, the General Assembly created Subdivision E to require that any future Public Records Act exemption would be reviewed every 5 years for repeal. But this language lifts that requirement, so this will be permanent. Section 1311 establishes the crimes and penalties. A person who is not permitted to conduct sports wagering pursuant to this chapter that operates, conducts, or exposes sports wagering for play or accepts a bet or wager associated with sports wagering shall be fined not more than $10,000 or imprisoned for not more than 6 months or both.
So does this mean that, not that we have a long enough arm here, but does this mean that people who continue to play, using the term we did with marijuana, like on the black market or offshore operators, could they now be, can the offshore operator under this law be charged with a crime? And could the bettor, himself or herself, be charged with a crime?
The provision here, so first applies to a person, so it would extend to offshore corporations as well, that operates, conducts, or exposes sports wagering for play. So this would only apply to the operator.
Okay.
There's no provision here for the individual that places the bet or the wager.
Okay.
So in theory, yes. In practice, you may want to bring in a criminal law expert who can testify as to whether this would allow Vermont to pursue those offshore actors.
Maybe we should bring in the offshore companies. I'm sure they'd be happy to come in, testify.
Subsection B provides that a person convicted of a second violation shall be fined not more than $25,000 or imprisoned not more than 1 year. Subsection C, the third or subsequent violations shall be fined not more than $50,000 or imprisoned for not more than 2 years. The effective date is July 1st, 2021. Thank you.
So there's
very
no,
much for
there's
your
no,
tolerance here.
there's no penalty or criminal offense against a bettor who, even though if this bill passed and we established a tax and regulated system here of going outside the agency system here and going using an offshore company.
That is correct. And there may be an easy explanation for why that choice has been made here. These sections appear to be taken directly from the previous sports wagering bill, and these were directed at the licensing program that was established in last year's bill. So these were criminal penalties that were aimed at persons who were conducting sports wagering outside of the established licensing system. It was not targeting persons who were placing the bets.
Okay, so my next question is related to that as well. So it seems like there's a big hole in this bill. It talks about the revenue shall be deposited in the general fund. What revenue?
The department is going to be contracting with each of these agents. And you're right that there is, despite the exhaustive clarity in some of the other sections, there's a piece missing here that explains how those contracts will be formed and what the revenue to the state will be. Perhaps that's just for the sake of flexibility for the department. But again, the department will be contracting with the sports wagering platforms and conducting some sports wagering through lottery outlets. So the assumption that the bill is making is that those contracts will be negotiated so that the state gets a share of the mobile sports wagering revenue from those 6 agents that operate within Vermont.
So it's not like marijuana where we set a rate of a certain percentage of the wagers should be turned over to the state, and we're leaving this to discretion of the department, or is there some applicable tax here that's already out there, like the sales tax or something like that?
This is left to the discretion of the department to form the contracts with the agents.
That's not going to fly. I think we want to have a say on that for sure. What do you know what? Well, I think I want to hear a little bit more from the potential agents here about the comparability to fantasy sports. I remember in fantasy sports, we just charged licensing fees, and that was it. I think other states went in different directions to try and achieve revenues. So we can leave it there, but there's, I mean, obviously the legislature has the power to impose a tax or fees on this new legalization here if it happens. But does your research, and we'll hear from the agents as well, potential agents, does your research show that that's just leaving it to the discretion of these contracts is the way the other states have gone? No specificity as to what the fee or tax is on these wagers?
Again, it varies. The most common model would be a tax on the gross receipts. And then the calculations of what those gross receipts consist of varies state to state. And that was the model that Vermont looked at in 2019 and 2020, was a flat rate tax on gross receipts and a licensing fee to operate in the state.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much. Any other questions for Tucker? I hope you can stick around. I'm gonna jump to Gary now just to see if he has anything he'd like to add to what he's heard so far, and then I'll probably bring Gary back after the Interlock and FanDuel testify as well. So Gary, briefly, do you have any thoughts you'd like to add at this point?
I don't have a lot to add. I'd be interested again to hear what the potential participants in the system would say. I know for Interlock, they would be involved on the lottery component of sports betting, and FanDuel more on the mobile side. I think it's important for Vermont to look at a multi-channel approach. I think a lot of the betting, what we've seen in other states, does happen on the mobile side, just because of its convenience. But that the lottery side is, that specifically through our lottery agents is also an important avenue, especially for newer bettors to be able to engage with. And also there's a lot of places that Vermonters could do that at our 600 or so agents. So I think that's certainly an important consideration. I know New Hampshire also, not only do they have the lottery side and the mobile side, they also have brick and mortar component to it as well. So a third channel, I don't know if that's worth considering now or something that might be discussed down the road.
So just for my own education before we move on, the lottery side is essentially a retooled lottery machine where you could go in and place a bet on a computer screen, get your ticket, and then come back to the convenience store and cash out. Is that essentially?
You could do that, or you could that'd be one way. Accounts could also be set up. There'd be multiple ways to do it, but you could cash out there. You could cash out at the bank that we partner with. If it was a bigger prize at the lottery offices, it tends to be that the lottery side, and again, I'm sure that that Interlot can talk about that Ms. Jones can talk about that, but that those tend to be a little bit simpler types of bets. You can place all kinds of bets on the mobile platform, but they're often parlay bets on the lottery side, and it would use the equipment that we already have. It wouldn't have to be necessarily replaced equipment. The equipment's all computerized, and it would just be a software update to make that, to enable
I
that.
assume to the extent we proceed on this at some point, whether it's now or who knows when, we'll get into the pros and cons of that. But I assume one of the pros of the lottery side would be that the convenience stores would like to have people coming in to their stores and buying other things as well as tickets. So
Absolutely, and they also make money off the sale of the product, the lottery product. So if they're betting on sports, those lottery agents also have an opportunity to make revenue.
Okay.
Directly from the sales, just to be clear, not just from other items.
Does anybody have any questions right now for Gary? He will come back at the end here. Okay. Let's hear from FanDuel, DraftKings. Are they the same? Are they one and the same? Andrew,
Well,
are they
thank
one
you.
and the same?
So
Okay.
they're not one and the same, but we're fierce competitors in the marketplace, but we work together on government affairs. I actually have a.
Before you get started, let me just tell you one thing I'd like you to touch upon, in addition to whatever presentation you have, is I know you were involved very closely in the fantasy sports bill that we passed a few years ago, and I'd just like a little refresher on that, how that's going, how the numbers played out the way they were projected, and just for the committee's education, just highlight the differences we're talking about here. I know they're somewhat stark, so if you could do that, that would be helpful.
Yes, absolutely. So we're very proud of our fantasy product and the offerings that we have and the customers that we have in Vermont. They are two different products. To kind of do a high level overview of the difference between them. Fantasy sports, you have to assemble a roster of players. The players are restricted to be from multiple different teams and multiple different events within the same sport. And then your roster competes against other players' rosters. And depending on the type of contest, depends on the way that it plays out. So there are head-to-head contests where you play directly against just one other player, and one of you wins the entry fees that were paid by the two of you, and the other loses. And then there's larger contests where the top winners or the top 50% of rosters, depending on how they perform, get paid out some version of a prize. As opposed to sports wagering, where you are directly wagering against the house, and your wager can be on a individual sports event. For example, are the Red Sox going to win today? And then whether or not that binary outcome happens, you either get paid or you lose your wager. Or you could also do parlay wagers, which has been discussed, which is a series of multiple wagers. And if you win on all of those, you win your bet.
So let me just ask you a question on fantasy sports. I understand that you help facilitate the setting up of the teams where two or more players compete. What I don't understand is the prize money.
Mhm.
There's cash that flows here, right? From the fantasy player. It's not just a non-cash game. There is some money involved and somebody wins something, right?
Correct. What happens is the players in the contest, in the fantasy contest, pay an entry fee. Then the contest plays out based on the statistical results of the roster that is assembled by each of the players. Whoever gets the most points based on the statistical performance of their roster wins, based on, again, the structure of the contest, and then the prizes are paid out to the winning participants. But there are a number of different structures, as I was saying. So, like, there are 50-50 contests where you might have 10,000 people in the contest, and the top 5,000 players win a prize that is just under double what their entry fee was, and the other half lose the entirety of their entry fee. You may have contests where there are a few number of winning players and they win large prizes and then everybody else loses. Or you have head-to-head contests where it might just be two players. They may know each other and be friends, they may not, and they play just one against another, and the winner gets the prize based on their entry fees.
So I guess the bottom line for me is if that fantasy sports, depending upon what the entry fees may be and what the prize may be, is sort of a form of gambling, right?
It actually is not. It's actually under the Federal Unlawful Internet Gambling Enforcement Act is explicitly exempted from the definition of what a bet or wager is. There are specific requirements that fantasy contests must take under the federal law in order to qualify. One of which is that you cannot assemble a roster based on an entire team. So, for example, if I was playing a Major League Baseball fantasy contest, I could not assemble my roster and have it be the entire Red Sox team. I would have to choose players from multiple teams in order to meet the requirements of the federal law. But that's the exemption that's provided.
Yeah.
I guess we're not on. Let me excuse me. Let me just follow up on that. When I'm thinking of gambling is, even though it's not called a wager, I'm putting up an entry fee with the hopes that my roster that I put together will win or either come up way ahead of many other players in my league, many other participants in my league, with the hopes of receiving prize money that's greater than my entry fee. So in that not legalistic sense, I am putting up money with the hopes that I'm going to get more money back. So people are playing that. I understand that it's much more like a social event in most cases. I mean, I have a family that does this. I don't participate in it, but they do it. They get a lot of laughs out of it and keeps them in communications. It's a form of entertainment for sure. But it sounds like within the fantasy sports world, there are people that are playing this thing against total strangers in their league with the hopes that they've picked better or got luckier in terms of the results so that they might come out with more money than they put in. Is that an unfair characterization?
So I think you hit on the key point, which is picking better. These are skill contests. It is based on the individual and their knowledge of the performance of athletes and their ability to determine the value of that athlete when setting their roster. This is more akin, for example, to something like someone paying an entry fee to enter a chess tournament and then performing in the chess tournament and then winning a prize based on whether or not they win the chess tournament because of their knowledge and ability at the game of chess.
Or putting $5,000 into the market.
Right. That would be another way to to consider that, which is in most states exempted from, I think every state exempt, securities law are
Right.
exempted from gambling statutes. Right.
Okay, got it. Okay. I think I understand. Senator Clarkson.
No, I was just going to say that it's betting on something that doesn't exist. As opposed to betting, it's sort of a fine line here between the fantasy aspect of this wager or this collective roster wager versus a betting on something that really exists. I don't know why. That seems to be a differential fine line.
It doesn't exist in the form, there's no team of this roster out there,
Right.
but the individuals do
Right.
exist. They're real people and they have records, and people assemble that, to the extent, I think it's, in my opinion, it's theoretically, maybe a lot of people take the time to understand people's records, but a lot of times they just, they'll just randomly pick people too on their roster. Yeah,
that's not what I understand from my sons. But
okay.
But I think you're right in that it's wagering is a wager is a wager. When you place money for something to happen, that strikes me as, the definition of a wager is you.
Yeah, I think where, I'm just talking off the top of my head, but I think the major difference is that many people in fantasy sports do it more for the social element. And even though people gamble for entertainment value, they also do it with a purpose to more on the financial end than perhaps the social end. So anyhow,
I think that's true.
Yeah. So let's Senator Rahm.
Well, I just feel like we're being a little hypocritical because we just had March Madness and had a lot of legislators participating in that pool. So, I just would caution us to sort of cast aspersions on other people because it is a really social element of what people do. We're not going to stop it. We're just trying to better regulate it and understand it.
I'm not in any way casting aspersions on people. So Andrew, we've interrupted you 3 times already. So if you want to proceed with your presentation, you could do that. If you want to update us on fantasy sport experience in Vermont, you could do that. But at some point, I would like to get to the fantasy sports as well.
Yes. Well, thank you, Senator. Let me take the time to go through the presentation, if I may, and then, we can follow up on fantasy at the end. Let me see if I can...
Andrew, the presentation is on our website if people...
Yes.
Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you. Let me see if I can share this here. Is everybody able to see this? Sports wagering in Vermont? Yep. Okay. So we're going to start... here we go. We're going to start with a little bit of legislative background. And I thank Tucker at the beginning for giving a little bit of introduction on where we are in the United States. Across the country, since the repeal of the Professional and Amateur Sports Protection Act in May of 2018, we're now up to 24 states, plus the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico that have authorized some version of sports wagering. As Tucker mentioned, it varies differently from state to state. So on the map here, you can see, for example, in Washington, New Mexico, and North Carolina, which are in yellow, they've authorized tribal gaming in person at tribal casinos for sports wagering. The blue states on the map have authorized online or mobile sports wagering. The red states have done commercial sports wagering, but only in person at facilities there. And the states of Maryland and Louisiana passed referenda in November of 2020 to authorize mobile sports wagering, and they are moving forward with legislation at this moment, but they have not yet enacted it.
When you say overwhelmingly, you said that was a referendum.
Yes.
Could you give us the numbers on those 2 states?
Yes, both those states, plus the state of South Dakota, which actually just recently passed legislation implementing its referenda. All 3 of those states in November 2020 passed with over 60% of the vote to allow for sports wagering.
Okay.
and virtually every other state has pending legislation or has looked at legislation in 2021, probably with the notable exemption, for example, of Utah. If we go into the Northeast, we can look here. As you see, New Hampshire and Rhode Island have authorized sports wagering, and every other state in the Northeast has pending legislation or has passed legislation. In the example of New York, within the past week in its budget, has passed legislation to allow for mobile sports wagering. New York already had in-person sports wagering authorized.
So
Also,
New York should be now in gray.
yes, once it goes live. So the two states, New Hampshire and Rhode Island, are live at the moment. New York is not live yet for mobile sports wagering, but it, based on the timeline in its budget, by this time next year, it should be live. Wyoming also, within the last week, enacted a law that would create a competitive mobile sports wagering market with a minimum of 5 licenses and a 10% tax rate. And that was similar to the provisions of S213 in Vermont from last year.
Does Massachusetts, I know they have casino gambling, do they have sports betting parlors in their casinos? Do you know?
So the legislation hasn't passed yet. It's still moving. The expectation, I believe, in Massachusetts would be that they will have both mobile and in-person sports wagering on the property at the casinos, but it's up to what eventually passes in Massachusetts.
So right now, the casinos that exist in Massachusetts don't have sports wagering in the casinos.
Correct.
Okay.
With the opportunity in Vermont, we'd like to point out that there is a significant illegal market. The estimated number of Vermonters wagering now is about 140,000, and that they wager about $292 million annually. Those numbers come from a study by the American Gaming Association and Oxford Economics. The estimated annual gross gaming revenue, if legal, to operators would be 31 million, and at a 10% tax rate estimate would be 3.1 million in tax revenue to the state.
So obviously, I'm maybe getting ahead of you here. You folks would like to see the tax rate. This is based on a 10% tax rate. You guys would like to see that probably in that range or lower to not have to continue to compete with the black market or the offshore market. But have there been any studies on, what's the tipping point? I mean, if we wanted to go higher, I'm guessing you might push back on that, but is there any studies that show, I mean, there's a great, I assume there's a great sense, one of your arguments is there's a great sense of security in knowing that there's a professional, licensed, legal person doing this, and that you ultimately won't have trouble getting your money or your winnings out, as opposed to not having that, as opposed to having that concern if you're dealing with somebody offshore. But where's the tipping point? They don't, or maybe they do. You'll get into this as to what the offshore companies are skimming is probably not the nicest word, or taking off the top. I think you got my question.
Yes.
Where is the number?
Yeah. So the so-called, I would say, sweet spot on taxation, as we've seen in other states, most other states fall in a range between 6 and 15% as a tax rate. There are some outliers, and there are, of course, states that do monopoly lottery products, which have a different rev share component. When you start getting above about a 15% tax rate, what you are doing is eating into the marketing spend of your operators. So they have to start reducing how much they spend on marketing to be able to pay that in taxes. And that then slows the conversion of bettors from the illegal market to the legal market. Because to your point, Senator, while bettors generally do, and there are AGA studies to point this out, that bettors do prefer betting in a legal regulated market for the reasons you exactly pointed out, it takes people time and convincing to move over from a product that they might have been using for years. And you need to be able to entice them to do that. The other thing is once you go beyond starting to chew into marketing budgets, you then affect the overall product itself. So if you, for example, are talking about in the liquor business and talking about a monopoly in there, if you're able to control the distribution, you can increase the prices dramatically and therefore have customers have to buy from you and that's their only source. In sports wagering, it has a similar effect. If you push the tax rate too high, you then will force the operators to adjust their lines and their odds that they offer to customers, making it a less attractive product. So for example, and sorry to get a little bit into the minutia here, but if FanDuel offers lines on a game, for example, that are disproportionate to what players can get on the illegal offshore market due to high tax rates in the state, the customers will bet with whoever has the best line, whoever has the best odds for them, because you're basically paying a premium to bet with FanDuel or DraftKings or MGM or any of the other legal operators. So for example, if I can bet $100 on the Red Sox game, and that's what I want to bet today, I think the Red Sox are going to win. If I bet, and the legal market odds are 2-1 that they'll win, but the offshore odds are 3-1, then I'm making the same bet, but I get paid more if they win by betting in the offshore market. So why would I bet in the legal market except for if I have severe concerns? So we're trying to make sure that the legal regulated market odds are staying as close as possible to those offshore, so the customers will be enticed to come into the legal market.
Matt,
Senator Clarkson, yes.
Andrew, is there any way that, particularly online, is there any way that if a state legalizes this, that they are able to intervene and have some sort of statement on the offshore website that says it makes clear this is not a legal way to do this now that we have is there any way for us to intervene? I don't know how to actually ask the right question, but that's my question.
So it's a difficult issue to get into. There are a limited number of ways that the state can try to take an affirmative position to support the legal regulated market. Obviously, most states, I think every state, puts on its websites what are the legal operators in the state, so that customers can come there and see, okay, these are the legal entities in my state. New Jersey has taken the step of licensing what are called affiliate marketers. So these are third-party sites which help the operators market to customers. Basically they're referral sites that they might have content or information about sports wagering that customers will go to, and then, click here to sign up for FanDuel or DraftKings or MGM. New Jersey has taken the step to say that you will lose your license as an affiliate marketer and not be able to work with entities in New Jersey if we find that you are also providing referrals to illegal offshore websites. So basically a crackdown on the entities that help refer customers to make sure that they are only referring customers to the legal regulated market in the state. That's another step that can be taken. I also know that there have been public information campaigns run, I believe, in New Jersey and Pennsylvania about trying to push bettors into the legal regulated market and to explain that the difference between the two and make customers more aware of the legal regulated options. And that's something that can also be done in other states.
And I suppose if we designate where this income is, what this income would be going to support, sort of like our lottery, which supports our education fund. We could market that, and some people take a pleasure in, as they place their lottery bets, that they know they're supporting the education fund. So
Correct.
that kind of thing, we could also have a proactive education and support this, whatever it is, support this with your bet.
Yes. That is another option as well.
Thanks.
Okay.
Going on to the next slide. This kind of then also points out to it and some of the concerns that Senator Sorokin was raising about the illegal market. Some of these sites advertise that or look very legit when you do a Google search or other internet search. And this actually is from a website that promotes illegal offshore operators, where they actually make the claim that in Vermont it is rarely enforced and only subject to a fine for bettors, which makes it worth the risk to residents to engage in wagering with offshore operators. So this is on the web right now, being told to Vermonters who may Google search sports betting that, hey, it's worth the risk. Nobody enforces the law against illegal sports wagering in your state. You can go ahead and do this, fairly risk-free. So I think that is a concern that you see, that it's hard to control what is out there on the internet and what is being told to Vermonters at the moment. So that's why creating a legal regulated market and highlighting that to Vermonters will be able to give them the option and the comfort of using a legal regulated product.
And when you say in this quote, if they want to gamble legally, they are forced to either visit a neighboring state. Because of that geofencing, that means they have to physically go to the other state. There's no way they can gain access to an online legalized program in another state.
Correct. Others, yes. Other states have requirements that operators or the state lottery model, if it's done that way, that you have to be geolocated physically in the state when you go to place your wager. So yes, you would have to physically drive, for example, to New Hampshire at the moment if you lived in Vermont.
So why is that a federal requirement? Why wouldn't New Hampshire want to invite Vermonters to play on their sites?
So that's a result of the Federal Wire Act of 1961. That is a requirement, basically prohibits the transmission of sports wagers across state lines.
Okay.
It was originally written to go after the illegal sports betting market back in the 60s, but it still applies today.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. And this just gets into why competition is important. It helps draw customers off the illegal offshore websites and into a legal regulated market. We have safe and proven online age and identity verification processes. We also facilitate responsible gaming through player self-limits and self-exclusion programs in concert with the state. It has been the overwhelming choice of bettors in many states. For example, in New Jersey, in the last month, over 92% of wagers were bet online. Same with Pennsylvania. In most states, you have over 85% of all bets being placed on mobile when that is an option. You have systems that are tested for consumer and fraud protection, for online deposits and withdrawals, and that it's able to provide, the online market's able to provide options to the customers when retail options are not available. For example, obviously during the pandemic, when many casinos and other facilities had to close at different times, mobile was still available. Also, obviously being in the Northeast, if there's winter storms or other circumstances that take place, you're still able to access your online sports wagering market when physical facilities may be closed. And just walking through some of the consumer protections that are in a legal regulated market, as I started to talk on the last slide, you have very rigid age and identity verification, a online verification process that's more comprehensive than in-person verification used at land-based facilities, the geolocation, which uses top-of-the-line geolocation providers. They are able to identify your location based on the GPS signal in your device or the Wi-Fi connection, and they're able to tell where you're located and make sure whether or not that you can wager from your location. Use of secure payment systems, whether it's online payment providers or entities like PayPal or others, or if you're using debit and credit cards and through your financial institutions, that information will be safe and protected. We also have a commitment to responsible gaming. We have responsible gaming professionals. We work diligently to build and to improve our responsible gaming program. One of the things that FanDuel is doing and implementing is the use of a company called GamBan, which when operators, so currently if you self-exclude with FanDuel, we will stop you from being able to wager with us. We will obviously report that to the appropriate entity and regulator in the state. You will then likely be, based on the state, added to the self-exclusion program for all the other operators within that state. And that's a great process. But that still does not necessarily prevent you from being able to wager with offshore operators who flout the law. So there's a company called GamBan who we are partnering in the process of partnering with, which actually does IP blocking, and the customer can sign up for this when they self-exclude, and we will provide the service to them where they will not be able to visit the websites of any legal or known illegal operator, gaming operator in the world. So this way, if they were to be tempted, although they obviously would be stopped from wagering with legal operators, they also would not be able to visit the websites of and would be effectively stopped from wagering with illegal operators as well. So it's an additional step to help those who need that assistance. We have player self-limits where players can set their own deposit limits, their wager limits on a daily, weekly, monthly basis. We have voluntary self-exclusion, as I just talked about. And then we also have responsible advertising, where we provide the information for national hotlines and websites for gaming assistance for those who need that.
Can you talk about the first one a little bit more? Why you
Yes.
feel online can be more comprehensive than in person?
Right. So for anyone who's ever walked into a casino, you may be ID checked, you may not be ID checked upon entry or upon sitting down at a table. It's very possible, you walk into a casino, if you look old enough, that you place, a couple $100 at the table, they give you your chips, you bet, you get up, you walk away, and nobody has ever actually confirmed whether or not you are necessarily on an exclusion list, whether or not you're necessarily a prohibited individual for whatever purpose, and there hasn't been the kind of the ID check that you would do with online sports wagering. What you would have is you'd have to create an account in order to wager. When a customer gives their information for that purpose, we then use what are known as KYC or Know Your Customer systems in order to verify who they are. Some of the top providers are companies like Aristotle and Ideology, where we would take the information given us by the customer, run it through those companies, and have it checked against known public databases to confirm that, this person who's claiming to set up the account is who they say they are. Sometimes we have to go back to the customer and ask for more information to make sure that they are who they say they are. We then let them, if they are ID'd and they are properly authorized to wager in the state, they're allowed to create the account, fund it, and then be able to go forward. So it is every single customer is known online.
So just as an example, is my driver's license, is that in a public database that one of these companies can find and verify?
I think it would have to depend on the state. We would be using the third-party service providers to do the identity confirmation. So I'd have to check specifically with them whether it be your driver's license, whether it be based on your social security number, based on credit information and running it against Experian or other credit databases, how they would actually identify the customer in that specific state, because I know that different states have different laws in relation to driver's license data privacy and other records. But those third-party service providers would be checking against whatever public databases are available and to confirm. And then we would potentially, as I said, if there's not enough information provided by the customer in the initial verification process, we would go back to the customer and ask for more information or do a more in-depth discussion with them to confirm that they are who they say they are.
Okay.
And then to finish up here, we have just a point to say that Vermont sports betting market will be the most successful if it promotes competition, encourages innovation, provides consumer protections, discourages the illegal sports wagering market, and generates new tax revenue to the state. And with that, if there's any questions, I'd be glad to take them.
Does anybody have any questions before we ask for a little history or summary of online sports fantasy sports, and then we'll take a 15-minute break. Could you just update us a little bit on how you're doing with fantasy sports in Vermont?
Yes, I think we're doing rather well in Vermont with fantasy sports. I apologize, I don't have offhand the number of customers or the revenue generation. I'd be glad to get that information to you on how we do.
That right. The JFO must have the income for that, what we're earning on that.
I think we just did a licensing fee, if I recall.
Yes, I believe so. And most states do a licensing. It completely, fantasy contests have a wide disparity in how states have handled them. There's a large number of states, I would say probably almost half, that actually just have a penal law exemption for fantasy sports, which basically states that acknowledges the federal law and says that they are exempted from the definition of gambling or bets or wagering in the state. Then there's a number of states that have a fee structure similar to that of Vermont, where it is a licensing fee. And then there are a relatively small number of states, and I can get the information on that have a taxation process on top of a licensing fee for fantasy.
Yes, that was an issue. I remember going back, and it wasn't, New York had a taxation scheme that was challenged in the courts. Has that case been resolved yet?
So that's not been finally resolved in New York. They do have a taxation scheme there. It gets into a question of the state constitution in New York and the authorization of whether or not it gets into a question of whether or not the legislature has the ability to define the term gambling for purposes of the statute in New York, and whether or not the exemption to the penal law, which is provided in that bill, can stand without the regulatory scheme that also is in the bill. So it's still pending. Yes,
still in litigation. Okay.
Yeah.
It'd be helpful to get if you can get us a short memo on the history of and numbers around fantasy sports for the committee. That would be helpful. Mm-hmm. Anything else you want to say about fantasy sports right now?
No, I think it's as I said, we've been very successful, and happy to provide any information that the committee is looking for. So we'll put that together for you.
One piece, and I could have this wrong, but I seem to remember that the projections were about 80,000 Vermonters participating back then. I don't know if there's any more updated data, whether that number proved high or low, or there's a way to get to that number in terms of projections. That would be helpful.
Right.
And what
I-
the volume, I mean, I assume that, I don't know if it's a trade secret or whatever, but the volume of play in fantasy sports, whether it be the number of participants or the number of entry fees, that kind of stuff in terms of what, how it's working out in Vermont.
Right.
Would be helpful.
Sounds
Okay.
good.
All right, let's take a break till 10:10, and we'll come back and we'll hear from Tara